Now, media coverage of the climate strike protests last week was grossly overheated and more than a little bit silly, don't you think? And it avoided important facts along the way. For starters, we had kids telling us what to do about complex national and global issues.
People are dying. The world is frying.
We came here to listen to save the world.
We want to protest against ScoMo and Adani coal. Yeah, because we don't like ScoMo and we want him out of the industry.
He's not in the industry, he's the Prime Minister.
Yeah, the Prime Minister industry.
Yeah, well, the Prime Minister industry wouldn't stand a chance against the climate alarmism industry or the political activism industry or even the media cheerleading industry. More on the terrible nature of most of this coverage in a moment, but let me point out that even before the protests began, media, including, of course, the ABC, were promoting the cause and rallying the troops.
19-year-old Grace Vegasana came to climate activism through a series of savvy political memes.
I saw these memes about environmental issues and especially climate justice that I was like, wait, these are actually really big issues in society.
It's not always easy putting yourself out there on these platforms, but for those willing to take a stand, the risks of not doing so are far greater.
We're terrified of the future, and the best way to cope with that, honestly, is by laughing at it sometimes.
They're hoping the memes pay off on the streets tomorrow. Ariel Bogle, ABC News.
Terrified of the future, hey? Not surprisingly, of course, the protest numbers were pretty impressive. Who wouldn't want to take a day off school or uni or even work when you're encouraged to do so? Still, even on the most generous estimates, something like 4% of students across the country might have attended, and they were far from the largest demonstrations we've seen in this country over recent decades. That didn't stop the hyperbole, though.
Many of the students here are too young to vote, but with a turnout as huge as this, their voices will be very hard to ignore.
Hard to ignore, except that the people who are old enough to vote, almost 17 million of them, 17 million of them, did have their say in an election just 4 months ago. They had the option of sticking with the government's Paris targets and renewable energy measures or opting for dramatically larger climate action under Labor. And we all know the result. This was a key point in all the coverage that I saw was ignored. We know where the public stands, of course. The protests are a futile guide against that electoral reality. Also, given what's happened to our power prices, our electricity system and our taxes, not too many Australians could be unaware that the governments around this country, local, state and federal, have spent tens of billions of dollars and been highly interventionist on climate policy already. But the protesters and much of the media went with the false premise that Australia is doing nothing.
We are going to make things more and more difficult for them until they secure a safe future for our generation and the generations to come. We've listened to the science, we learnt it at school, we're out here today demanding action and our government is not taking it.
We are on the outskirts of the biggest catastrophe humanity has ever faced and our government is doing nothing.
Despite these erroneous attacks on the government, those reports failed to mention that protest leader Daisy Jeffrey is the daughter of opposition leader Anthony Albanese's speechwriter. Now, it's not a huge point. I know her dad well. He's a former colleague and her activism predates his job with the opposition leader. But it's hard to imagine a link to, say, the Prime Minister's office in some sort of protest would be ignored by the media. And also, none of the coverage I saw bothered to point out that whether you argue it's not enough or it's too much, it's simply flying in the face of reality to say that the government is not doing anything on climate change. In this way, the coverage barracked for the protests and amplified their misinformation rather than report the facts and put them into context. And have a look at the groupthink. On Twitter, The Guardian's deputy editor David Monk admonished the ABC for not pushing enough positive coverage of the protests. Tens of thousands on the streets and parks across the country, and ABC News not covering on its website. Hardly a reference to the climate strike, he tweeted. The one story is a negative one. Mentioning, of course, linking that to the ABC's news boss. Before you could say climate crisis, ABC technology reporter Michael Slezak was apologising and explaining. The website was leading with a preview story this morning, and it's now leading with reporting from the protests. And yesterday, you had a story about the protests too. You may have just looked as it was transitioning from one story to the other, he tweeted out. Watching on, one perceptive tweet observed, "It's nice to see the media policing each other to make sure everyone is pushing the acceptable narrative of the day." Yeah, we all know, of course, that groupthink happens by osmosis all the time. But here, it was being openly and blatantly enforced. While plenty of facts were missing, there was no mistaking the feelings of the journalists. 10 News reporter Alex Bruce Smith declared these kids are going to rule the world, and television reporters warmed to the task.
They're fed up with inaction on climate change, and they're really hoping that this massive display of people power here in Sydney and right across the country will send a very clear message to the Morrison government that they want to see more done.
Tonight, Australia leads the charge in global climate strikes, with thousands calling out inaction and denial.
The world will hear us today.
Well, today, hundreds of thousands of students skipped school because they had something a little more important to attend to, the future of the planet. They were backed by thousands more grown-ups fed up with the lack of action and ongoing denials.
Solidarność. It was impossible to scrutinise all of the coverage, of course, but of what I saw, only 10's Hugh Remington bothered to inject some reality about the protest demands.
They demand no new oil, coal or gas projects, including Queensland's Adani mine, and 100% renewable energy, including exports, by 2030. Demands that would wipe out industries currently worth over $100 billion a year.
Across the coverage, there was a pretty obvious sense that the protesters were admirable. Their critics, not so much.
The old blokes in suits, though, well, they weren't really listening.
A whole lot of absolutely irresponsible activists right now.
You are being used and manipulated, and everything you are told is a lie. Don't be a sheep, think for yourself.
Luckily, they are thinking for themselves.
Looks like we'll be waiting a long time before journalists learn to think for themselves on climate change issues. And just when you thought the debate couldn't get any dumber, look at this. Yes, similar reports in 9 media newspapers quoted young couples who are pledging not to have children because global warming is too scary. "My conscience says I can't give this child what I've enjoyed," said one woman. "I can't give them the certainty of a future where they can be all they can be or have the things they should have, like breathable air and drinkable water." Her partner said he'd love kids, but not when the world's heading blindfolded towards catastrophe. Wouldn't it be great if people stuck to the science, you know, to the facts and reason? Still, as I said in my Australian column this morning, there is an upside to these hysterical alarmists deciding not to have children. If you understand the science of natural selection, you can understand that it means within a generation or two, we might be able to have a more intelligent climate debate.